The red combat lights hummed, casting a blood-dimmed glare across the control room of the USS Shadowhawk. 200 meters beneath the surface, the vessel glided through the crushing black abyss. Captain Reeves stood motionless, his eyes locked on the sonar screen. An enemy destroyer was closing in at 3,000 yards. "Maintain ultra-quiet. No unnecessary systems," he commanded. The order rippled through the crew, but the silence was heavy. The air inside the hull turned thick and stale. Sweat beaded on every forehead, dripping from chins onto cold consoles. Lieutenant Commander Harris wiped his brow, his hand shaking slightly as he looked toward the overhead vents. "Skipper, the air conditioning is struggling," he whispered. "The temperature is climbing. Humidity is at 85%. If the chillers go down, we are cooked." Reeves felt the heat pressing against his skin like a physical weight. He looked at the gauges. The needle on the thermometer was creeping upward, and the air felt thinner with every passing second. Every man in the control room fought the urge to gasp, knowing that any sound could betray their position. The ship was no longer just a war machine. It was a sealed steel pressure cooker, and the heat was rising. In the engineering compartment, alarms pulsed in a rhythmic, nerve-wracking staccato. Sparks stood before the refrigeration console, his eyes darting across the flickering readouts. "This is not your home air conditioning," he shouted over the hum of the turbines. "Submarine air conditioning is life support. We are sealed in a steel tube. No fresh air for weeks." He slapped a schematic onto the bulkhead. "The system runs on a vapor compression cycle. 4 heroes in the loop: compressor, condenser, expansion valve, evaporator." He pointed to the coils. "Refrigerant starts as low-pressure vapor. Massive fans suck hot air over the coils. The refrigerant absorbs the heat, boils into gas, and pulls the temperature down. It pulls moisture out so the electronics do not fry." Suddenly, a crewman collapsed at his station, his body hitting the grating with a dull thud. Sweat dripped onto the controls. "Chief, it is getting hard to think," he groaned. The thermometer hit 95 degrees. Sparks ignored the distraction, his hands moving with frantic precision across the valves. "If the evaporator fails, the heat will spike. The electronics will short-circuit. We lose stealth, and we die in the dark." He tightened a bolt, his knuckles white, as the entire compartment groaned under the thermal load. Outside, the enemy destroyer pinged. The sound echoed through the hull like a hammer on a bell. The Shadowhawk banked hard, tilting the deck to evade detection. Sparks lunged for the main manifold, but a violent shudder rocked the engineering compartment. A pipe rattled against the bulkhead, screaming under the pressure. Then, the flow stopped. The seawater intake had clogged. Condenser pressure plummeted, and the temperature readout spiked into the red. Sparks cursed, yanking open a service panel. Steam hissed, scalding the air and forcing him to recoil. He hammered the gauge. But the needle remained pinned. The heat began to build exponentially. Electronics flickered, threatening to short out and give away their position. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the mechanical roar. Captain Reeves spoke, his voice ice cold. "Chief, we have torpedoes inbound in 6 minutes. Fix it, or we surface and die." Sparks stared at the clogged intake, his chest heaving. The weight of the entire crew rested on the cooling loop. He turned to his team, his eyes fixed on the critical valves. "We have no choice," he yelled. "Grab the heavy wrenches. We are going in." Sparks moved in a blur, his hands tearing at the locking pins of the primary bypass valve. The heat in the compartment was suffocating, thick enough to taste. Another crewman dropped, his head striking the steel deck as he lost consciousness. "Move him," Sparks roared, not looking back. 2 others dragged the limp body aside, clearing the path to the main intake. Sparks jammed a heavy iron bar into the lever, throwing his entire weight against the rusted metal. It groaned, shifted, and finally snapped open. A massive burst of seawater sprayed across the floor, cold and violent, as the intake purge cleared the blockage. The pressure gauge swung wildly, finally dropping out of the red zone. Sparks lunged for the electrical override. He slammed the master switch forward. The hum of the system changed instantly. The massive fans began to whine, rising in pitch as they clawed at the stagnant air. The evaporator coil frosted over, biting into the heat with renewed intensity. 200,000 BTUs an hour. The airflow picked up, pulling the suffocating heat out of the steel tube. Sparks stood over the console, chest heaving, his face slick with sweat, watching the temperature needle drop degree by agonizing degree. The temperature gauge finally settled into the blue. In the control room, the air turned crisp, and the men straightened their backs, their breathing slowing to a steady rhythm. Sonar pings from the enemy destroyer grew faint, then vanished entirely into the background noise of the deep ocean. The Shadowhawk had regained its cloak of silence. Sparks stood alone in the dark engineering compartment, wiping the salt and grease from his face with a rag. He listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of the cooling system. It was the only thing keeping the crew alive in the crushing pressure of the abyss. He looked up at the steel bulkhead, his hand resting on the vibrating pipe. Without this loop, the submarine was not a weapon of war. It was just a 300-foot steel coffin, drifting in the dark. The sub banked slowly, turning deeper into the black water. The red combat lights dimmed, replaced by the soft, steady glow of normal operations. Sparks pushed the repair log aside and turned back to his console, ready to keep the Devil's Fridge running for another watch.